Please, I beg you.
Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore one of the greatest figures in English history, Queen Elizabeth I. She was a woman who transformed being single, surrounded by enemies, and becoming a virgin queen into not just a choice, but a threat to anyone who dared to challenge her power. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is for you. It's fascinating to know that friends from all over the world are joining us on this journey. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Elizabeth Tudor was born in 1533, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, yet from her very first breath, tragedy and politics had already claimed her life. Picture a small, pale-faced infant in a chilly royal chamber, swaddled in silks but surrounded by whispers. Before she was even 2 years old, Elizabeth bore witness to the most horrifying spectacle a child could imagine. Her mother led, trembling, to the scaffold at the Tower of London, accused in spidery ink of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. The heavy thud of the executioner's axe must have resonated in her infant mind like a terrible lullaby. Almost immediately afterward, in a stern session of Parliament, she was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, her allowance cut in half, and her royal household dismissed as though she were a broken toy. Once beloved as a princess, Elizabeth suddenly became a political inconvenience. One moment she was addressed as "Your Highness," and the next she was packed off to the damp, windswept countryside like a failed public relations campaign. The grand court that once fluttered around her in lace and velvet all but ignored her existence unless, that is, they needed a living reminder of the folly of marriage. And so, tucked in a drafty manor house, Elizabeth Tudor discovered books as her sole companions. Latin and Greek tomes lay open on a small wooden desk. French dictionaries teetered in a precarious pile. Heavy volumes on philosophy and theology guarded secrets she was determined to unlock. By the time she had ticked through each year of her childhood, Elizabeth had mastered 5 languages, but remained utterly mute about her own feelings. If her heart ached, she did not cry. If she was frightened, she did not tremble before her tutors. Instead, she channeled every emotion into study. The crisp declensions of Latin grammar, the elegant verses of Cicero, the austere logic of Thomas Aquinas. With every line she committed to memory, she felt herself grow stronger, more invincible, invisible armor, made of syllables and syntax. When she turned 9, Elizabeth chose for herself a motto in Latin, whispered late at night by candlelight: "Video et taccio, I see, and I say nothing." It was her solemn vow against vulnerability, a promise to shield her fragile heart from the venomous intrigues swirling around her. She watched with unblinking eyes as her father's wives came and went, each departure more sudden, more bloody than the last. Anne of Cleves vanished almost overnight. Catherine Howard went from queen to condemned in the space of a breath. From these revolutions of the royal bedchamber, Elizabeth learned 2 essential lessons: never grow too fond, and never trust a monarch steeped in scandal. Inside the high, narrow corridors of the Tudor court, Elizabeth perfected the art of silence. She greeted Protestant envoys with devout nods. She received Catholic emissaries with respectful bows. In each scenario, her countenance remained calm, her lips barely parted, as though her entire mind lay hidden behind a velvet curtain. To the outsider, she was the demure little girl perched in a corner, reading Cicero by the faint glow of an oil lamp. But behind those dark, thoughtful eyes, she catalogued every face, every whisper, every clandestine gesture. She stored these treasures like a squirrel hoards nuts for winter, memorizing alliances and betrayals with ruthless precision. Her tutors were among the finest in Europe scholars and poets invited from Paris, Oxford, and Wittenberg to refine her speech and shape her thoughts. Yet the most vital lesson sure was never found in any textbook: how to survive in a fractured royal family that resembled a labyrinthine court drama more than a dynasty. Henry's marital history was a parade of misfortune. Wives beheaded, marriages declared null, mistresses installed, then discarded. Each taught Elizabeth that the gilded life of a princess could transform overnight into something far more sinister. She did not compose pale, sorrowful verses about her own suffering. Instead, she embraced the creed of quiet observation, accumulating knowledge like a general planning for war. Day by day, she schemed in the shadows, simply by watching, learning, and saying nothing. Every slight glance from a nobleman, every hushed conversation between counselors, became data for her to analyze. She catalogued motives and ambitions with clinical detachment, forging a mind as sharp as any sword. From her earliest hours, Elizabeth honed a singular gift, the ability to divorce emotion from strategy, to convert pain into political leverage. Even as a child, she cultivated the mystique of the untouchable princess, hiding her inner landscape behind an impenetrable mask. At night, she would sit alone in her small chamber, the flicker of a single candle dancing on the pages of her books, her heart beating steady and slow as she whispered her prayers of resolve. This foundation of intellect and stoicism would carry her through a life beset by peril, imprisonments, plots, religious wars, and threats of assassination. But at the tender age of 13, nurtured by tragedy, sustained by study, Elizabeth had already built within herself an unshakable core of will. When the crown eventually passed to her, she would step into the lion's den, not as a frightened girl in need of protection, but as a sovereign armed with the greatest weapons of all: silence, observation, and the fierce knowledge that she alone controlled her destiny. In that quiet apprenticeship, Elizabeth Tudor transformed from a displaced princess into a master of the royal game, ready for the moment when the world would finally listen to the words she chose not to speak. In the year 1554, a chill wind blew through England that carried not only the promise of spring rain, but also the heavy scent of suspicion and dread. Elizabeth Tudor, then just 21 years old, found herself swept up in the uneasy tides of religious turmoil and political conspiracy. Though she had always stood at the margin, a silent observer rather than an active participant. Yet when Sir Thomas Wyatt rose in rebellion against Queen Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, rumour and fear conspired to entangle Elizabeth's name in whispered allegations. She, who had lived in courtly shadows since childhood, was now summoned no gentle invitation but a summons to the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, where the kingdom's greatest traitors trembled in gloom. Imagine her, stepping through the infamous Traitor's Gate beneath an unrelenting downpour, each drop like a heavy word falling on caged wings. The rain battered her velvet cloak and plastered her auburn hair to her forehead, yet her gaze remained steady. She walked not as a frightened girl, but as one who had learned, in her years of exile from comfort, that calm could be armour. As the gate clanged shut behind her, Elizabeth's heart may have hammered in her chest, but her lips simply parted in a cool, unwavering declaration. She was innocent, and she begged only for the chance to live. Within those damp, echoing chambers, Elizabeth faced a spectrum of psychological torments designed to crush even the hardiest spirit. Guards shoved coarse straw into her cell's corners, allowing rats to scuttle beneath her mattress, their tiny claws scratching in the dark. The rooms reeked of mildew and despair, and she could hear the distant drip of water, the only promise of movement in a place where time itself seemed imprisoned. Interrogators arrived at odd hours, their questions sharp as knives, each answer weighed against silence to break her will. They demanded confession, coaxed tears, threatened death, yet Elizabeth, unlike many noble women broken by fear, did not scream or faint. She did not plead beyond her simple plea for life. Each night, in the lonely hush broken only by the scuttling of vermin, Elizabeth found herself tracing the cold stone walls with her fingertips until her nails chipped, then turning to the one refuge she still possessed: her mind. There, she rehearsed her defences, recalled every friendly whispered counsel she had exchanged in youth, and then, almost defiantly, she took a small knife hidden in the hem of her gown, smuggled, perhaps by a sympathizer, and carved her name into the turret wall. The letters ran ragged and uneven: E-L-I-Z-A-B-E-T-H, like a whispered truth in the dark. It was her silent manifesto. I was here. I did not yield. Months passed in that subterranean world, and all around her, hope withered like flowers in winter. Mary's courtiers paraded evidence, decried Elizabeth's lineage and insisted on her guilt. But the Queen, herself beleaguered by rebellion and struggling to unite a fractured realm, found no proof sturdy enough to sustain a sentence of execution. And so, when at last Elizabeth was released from her dreadful vigil, she was not dispatched back to court triumphantly, but relegated to house arrest upon a damp estate in the countryside. A pale mercy that offered barred windows opening on windswept fields, rather than the dank walls of a prison cell. In those quiet months under supervised liberty, Elizabeth wandered along narrow dirt paths that skirted muddy pastures, pausing to study the skeletal trees beneath a leaden sky. Her letters from court were few and coded. Her days were spent reading the letters of Cicero and poring over treatises on governance, weaving freshly learned prose into arguments she might one day employ. Each detail of her imprisonment, the squeal of startled rats, the cold damp seeping into her bones, she catalogued in a mental ledger. Every name uttered in whispered accusation, every guard's leer of triumph became data in a vast internal dossier. She understood now that blood ties afforded no safety in politics, that innocence alone could not protect against the relentless machinery of power, and she learned to pack a spare set of dry clothes in a velvet pouch, aware that being cold and wet distorted the mind and dulled the will. Yet, in the weeks before Queen Mary's death in November of 1558, few among the English nobility dared to speak openly of Elizabeth as a successor. To many, she was that young woman who had trodden the damp stones of the Tower's depths, a monarch in waiting whose claim was marred by whispers of treason. And yet it was precisely her unflappable composure, in the face of dire threat her refusal to faint, to plead, or to break, that slowly reshaped her reputation. Those who once doubted her strength now saw that she had endured what few could imagine, and emerged only more resolute. When Mary at last drew her final breath, the kingdom lurched on the brink of chaos. The royal coffers were drained, the populace weary of religious persecution, and the threat of civil war loomed large. In those uncertain days, Elizabeth did not linger in anxious hesitation. She gathered her summonable horses, clad in simple yet purposeful riding attire, and rode toward London as though summoned not by courtly decree, but by destiny itself. Along the way, villagers who had once whispered her name in caution now lined the muddy roads to cheer her passing. Priests and reformed preachers alike set aside doctrinal quarrels, offering prayers for her safe arrival. And when she reached the city's gates, she was met not with the tense rigidity of protocol, but with an outpouring of relief, an adulation that rose like a tide from the Thames embankments to the palace balconies. Thus, Elizabeth Tudor, once condemned to the Tower and confined by barbed suspicion, entered London as a figure transformed by fire and exile. The thunder of rain was gone, replaced by the quiet hymns of hopeful crowds. The scars of her imprisonment remained unseen beneath her gowns of rich wool and velvet, but her eyes held a calm fire, a promise that the realm would know a queen who had not merely survived its cruelties, but had mastered them. And so she ascended the throne, not only as a living testament to endurance, but as a sovereign tempered by adversity, ready to guide England through the stormy seas that lay ahead. On the 15th of January, 1559, Elizabeth Tudor at last stepped into Westminster Abbey to claim the crown that fate had long dangled just out of reach. The air was brittle with cold, each breath forming a faint mist that drifted upward toward the lofty vaults. Outside, London's streets were a river of humanity, commoners pressed against curious nobles, all craning their necks to glimpse the procession. A thin crust of ice cracked beneath the hooves of horses and the polished boots of gentlemen in velvet cloaks. No one quite knew whether to cheer or stand in hushed reverence, for the girl who had once walked through the Tower's Traitor's Gate now moved past them as queen. Elizabeth, unaccustomed perhaps to applause that rang honest rather than fearful, let a small, serene smile cross her lips as she emerged from the Abbey's shadowed doorway. She wore a flowing gown of white silk, embroidered with threads of burnished gold, that caught the weak winter light like distant stars. Around her neck gleamed a simple string of pearls, no extravagant diadem, but a quiet testament to her preference for substance over show. In that moment she seemed at once ethereal and utterly determined, as though she had gathered every hardship she had endured and folded it into a single vow of survival. Inside the Abbey, the ceremony unfolded in a flurry of whispered confusion. Heralds fumbled with parchment, their voices echoing too loudly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Courtiers, still unsure of protocol, exchanged anxious glances. A few pipers lost their place in the fanfare, sending a wobbly note through the hush. Yet Elizabeth seized this fleeting disorder and made it her own. When the dean offered her the orb and scepter, symbols of temporal power and divine trust, she accepted them with a graceful nod, her hand steady as though nothing in the world could unbalance her now. Her coronation speech, delivered in measured tones that barely rose above a whisper, carried a weight far greater than any shout. "I, Elizabeth," she began, her voice echoing softly through the stone, "have endured much in these years. Loss, exile, suspicion. Yet I stand before you today to pledge justice, to promise stability, and to seek unity for all under my reign." She paused, letting each word sink into the silence. "I make no declarations of creed tonight, nor speak of marriage. My loyalty is to England, and that alone." In that deliberate omission lay her masterstroke. The realm's two great confessions, Catholic and Protestant, leaned forward, uncertain whether to celebrate or oppose. No clear allegiance meant no immediate schism. She had not denied Rome, nor had she embraced the new faith. Instead, she had erected a careful buffer, a space in which she alone would determine the future. Both sides, wary of alienating their new queen, held their counsel close, content to watch and wait. No sooner had the last strains of organ music faded than ambassadors from across Europe flooded the palace gates with offers of marriage. A handsome French prince sent a portrait in a gilded frame. A Spanish envoy delivered a casket of jewels set in emerald and onyx. Swedish dignitaries arrived bearing furs and fine tapestries. Even her own court suggested suitable suitors from the neighbouring dukedoms. But Elizabeth, wise beyond her years, treated each proposal as though it were a diplomatic invitation to a grand chess match. She accepted the gifts, each jewelled collar, each silk-lined glove, yet never granted the solemn nod that would seal a union. In audience chambers lit by wavering candlelight, she conversed in gentle tones, praising the generosity of each envoy, complimenting the artistry of each portrait. Then, with a calm and courteous turn, she would thank them and bid them farewell, her face a placid mask that revealed nothing of her intent. To her, marriage was less a romantic bond than a treaty of commerce, one that must be weighed carefully for risk and reward. A Spanish husband might bring military might, but at the cost of her independence. A French match could strengthen her position against Catholic forces, yet risk entangling England in foreign wars. A princely English noble could charm her court, but would inevitably become a rival centre of power. Better, she decided, to remain unattached, to keep every suitor hoping, every king calculating, every courtier guessing. This deliberate singleness became her most potent instrument. By keeping the question of marriage forever open, she ensured that no foreign power could ever claim authority over her. Each suitor, no matter how eager, understood that their suit might never bear fruit, and so they scrupulously courted her favour, hoping that their patience would one day be rewarded. In the meantime, their diplomacy kept alliances fluid and their ambitions in check. Thus, Elizabeth turned her unmarried state into a grand political gambit. She held out the prospect of alliance like a glimmering prize, deftly extracting concessions and assurances from those who sought her hand. She negotiated trade agreements, secured military support, and maintained a careful balance among the great powers of Europe, all without binding herself to a husband's banner. Her court thrummed with the soft tension of hope and hesitation, each envoy mindful that a single word from her lips could shift the tide of alliances. In those early days of her reign, Elizabeth Tudor seated herself upon the throne, not as a timid successor, but as a sovereign who had mastered adversity. She wore her virgin crown as though it were forged of steel, unyielding, incorruptible, and fiercely her own. And under her watchful gaze, England began to breathe free of faction and fear, stepping slowly from the shadows of past reigns into a new dawn shaped by the Queen who would never be anyone's consort, only her people's chosen ruler. Unlike many monarchs who delegated the weight of governance to trusted ministers, Elizabeth I conducted the business of state with her own hand. In the hushed, candle-lit hours of the palace, she personally reviewed every dispatch, every treaty draft, and even the precise font size of royal proclamations. There was no proclamation too small for her scrutiny, no letter so trivial that it escaped her eye. When courtiers delivered new policy proposals on matters from alliances abroad to road maintenance at home, she read them methodically, sometimes aloud in the presence of her council, so that every nobleman felt the slow burn of her attention. Her privy council was a motley assembly. Some were unwavering loyalists who hung on her every word. Others were opportunists, drifting from faction to faction in search of advantage. A few were earnest but ill at ease, uncertain how to obey direct orders from a queen. And that, Elizabeth discovered, was itself a formidable advantage. By maintaining a council so diverse in temperament and background, she fostered an atmosphere of polite intimidation. Knights and earls, used to ruling servants and peasants, now found themselves edging forward in Elizabeth's presence, whispering nervously lest they overstep. Elizabeth's favoured strategy was what she privately called the promise half-spoken. She doled out honours and offices sparingly, granting a barony here or a knighthood there, but never with such abandon as to leave her courtiers secure. Each reward felt like a treasure liberated from a dragon's hoard, to be received with gratitude and awe. Invitations to her private presence were similarly rare and always too brief. She might summon an adviser to offer approval of a treaty, only to deliver a measured, "We will consider this further," before dismissing him with a curt nod. Weeks, sometimes months, would pass before the final seal of her agreement arrived, carefully scrawled in her delicate hand. In those interludes, councillors paced hallways, exchanged anxious glances, and prayed that their proposals remained fresh in her memory. This deliberate uncertainty created in her court the most powerful attitude of all, deference born of hope. A minister might once have marched boldly into her chambers, expecting instant royal favour. Under Elizabeth's reign, he instead approached on tiptoe, head bowed, words clipped to avoid the imposition of impertinence. The very atmosphere in Whitehall hummed with a quiet tension, for none knew when her generosity might blossom, or when it might wither from neglect. In tandem with her mastery of timing, Elizabeth weaponized her wardrobe. Each gown was a calculated statement. She commissioned dresses of ivory silk, embroidered with golden thread in swirling patterns that echoed the sun and its rays subtle reminders of her self-proclaimed role as the light of England. On occasions requiring stern resolve, she donned garments shot through with dark velvet and armour, like detailing, evoking a warrior queen prepared to defend her realm. Her wigs were masterpieces of structure, piled high and adorned with jewels that caught the gaslight in glittering flashes. A simple tilt of her head revealed a flash of pearls, symbols of purity, but also of untouchable wealth. No one else in her court dared replicate these styles. Elizabeth even issued sumptuary laws, forbidding her subjects from wearing certain fabrics and colours, thus ensuring that her presence remained visually unparalleled. Perhaps most uncanny was her choice of cosmetics. Elizabeth's face, always pale as fresh snow, was achieved through layers of white lead-based powder, a dangerous concoction, no doubt, but one that bestowed upon her an almost otherworldly countenance. In candlelight, she seemed to float rather than walk, her alabaster skin rendered luminous. To her courtiers, she looked less like a living monarch and more like an apparition, ethereal and remote, half goddess and half ghost. It was a visage meant to remind all who beheld her that they stood not before a woman but before an icon. Yet it was not only in matters of ceremony that Elizabeth acted as a hands-on ruler. She also managed the flow of information with an iron resolve. Her Secretary of State, William Cecil, later Lord Burghley, once lamented that he spent as much time drafting and redrafting memoranda as he did negotiating matters of war and peace. A single proposal could circle among scribes for weeks, its lines rewritten, its language refined, until it met the Queen's exacting standards. Any draft deemed too blunt might be returned with excisions. Any that dared to be overly bold might vanish altogether. This bureaucracy, though maddening to her ministers, achieved a singular purpose. It rendered her court utterly dependent on her assent. No policy moved forward without her personal approval, and every day courtiers awaited her judgment as though it were a survival matter. In this way, Elizabeth maintained a delicate balance of power. She appeared in council only when necessary, yet everyone knew that absence was no happy reprieve. Her silence was as potent as her word, a constant reminder that the source of mercy and authority lay solely with her. In combining these tactics, meticulous oversight of documents, strategic delay of favours, theatrical dress, and control of every line in every royal letter, Elizabeth crafted an environment in which she reigned not merely by law or lineage, but by psychological mastery. Her courtiers, arrayed before her in their finery, felt both the warmth of her rare smiles and the chill of her deliberate silences. She conducted her government like the conductor of a grand orchestra, every note precisely timed, every pause pregnant with potential. And through it all, she rested at the heart of England's brilliance, an unshakable presence, both revered and feared, guiding her realm through uncertain times with the quiet strength of a sovereign who knew that true power lay in commanding the minds and hearts of those who served her. Elizabeth Tudor's reign was not defined by grand parades alone, but by a quiet industry of secrets woven deep beneath the tapestries of her court. She understood, as few monarchs did, that true sovereignty required not only open diplomacy, but also a hidden network of intelligence. To that end, she entrusted her most valued confidant, Sir Francis Walsingham, to craft what might well be described as the first incarnation of MI6. In shadowed rooms within Whitehall, Walsingham and his agents intercepted foreign correspondence, cracked ciphers with patient precision, and shadowed suspected traitors through the tangled streets of London. Even ambassadors from rival powers found their own staff infiltrated by Elizabeth's loyal informants, some of whom passed coded messages back to the Queen under the cover of polite conversation. By any measure, this budding intelligence service was revolutionary. Couriers carrying letters from Rome to Madrid or Paris to Vienna were obliged, by Walsingham's mandate, to submit their messages for inspection before they reached their intended recipients. Any missive bearing the slightest hint of sedition was extracted, its contents read aloud at the next Privy Council meeting, where Elizabeth sat draped in velvets and pearls, listening in near silence, as conspiracies were laid bare. She heard of plots to poison her wine, of whispered alliances between disaffected earls and foreign princes, of clandestine masses held in hidden manor houses, all catalogued and exposed before they could bloom into full-blown rebellions. Thanks to this intricate web of spies, Elizabeth knew the contours of danger long before her enemies could draw their plans in ink. Several assassination attempts were foiled on the cusp of execution. Once, when a bottle of supposedly vintage wine was found to contain a deadly tincture, and again when a guard's midnight knock concealed a blade hidden in the folds of his cloak. Time and again, Walsingham's agents disrupted the threads of treason. Earning the Queen a reputation that spread beyond England's cramped cottages to the grand courts of Europe. She became known, in hushed admiration, as the monarch who could not be ambushed, the Queen immune to dagger or poison, the sovereign whose security apparatus seemed to anticipate every act of betrayal. Elizabeth's mastery of intelligence did more than protect her person. It became the model for every empire that followed. The Spanish, the French, even the Ottoman Porte would glimpse her success and strive to cultivate similar networks. In that way, she seeded the idea that information itself was power, the silent currency by which nations waged unseen wars. At the same time, Elizabeth enforced an equally meticulous control over her own image. No portrait of her visage was to stray beyond the official pattern she authorized. Painters were instructed to portray her with flawless skin, high forehead, and keen, unblinking gaze, a visage of ageless resolve. Any depiction that betrayed fatigue lines or the slightest imperfection was ordered destroyed. Reproductions of her likeness, in print or on tapestry, required her approval. Any rogue canvas or woodcut that dared show the Queen's diminutive height, her slight limp, or the pallor of her lead-based powder, faced the artist's disgrace, often swift punishment. Words, too, were catalogued as national treasures. Elizabeth's speeches and letters were deemed the property of the Crown. Any editor who dared embellish her prose, or any pamphleteer who spread rumours about her health or intentions, might find himself imprisoned, or, in less fortunate cases, facing more draconian consequences. In this manner, the Queen extended her reign into the realm of thought and rumour, ensuring that the narrative of her rule remained unchallenged. Yet all these strands of subterfuge and image management reached their greatest crescendo in the summer of 1588, when the mightiest naval force of the age, the Spanish Armada, bore down upon England's shores. As the great fleet unfurled its sails to blockade her ports, Elizabeth calmly prepared her people for war. She journeyed to Tilbury, a small town on the Thames estuary, where thousands of soldiers stood at dawn, their faces drawn with fatigue and fear. There, clad in lightweight breastplate and buff leather dress, she addressed them with a voice that trembled only with the weight of history. "I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she confessed softly, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The sight of their queen, riding slowly along the embankments, her auburn hair bound beneath a simple coif, filled the troops with sudden, fierce pride. They who had been on the brink of despair now stood straighter, their rusting armour seeming to catch a spark of new resolve. Elizabeth's presence became the very catalyst that turned panic into courage, transforming raw recruits and seasoned veterans alike into a united fighting force. When the Armada approached, the English ships, smaller but swifter, harried the lumbering Spanish galleons with fireships and cunning tactics. The wind itself seemed to favour the defenders, scattering the Armada into disarray. Waves smashed the broad decks of the invaders, while English letters of marque pounced upon disabled vessels. By the time the battered remnants limped home, hundreds of Spanish sailors lay drowned in the northern seas, bringing humiliating defeat upon Philip's haughty ambition. Elizabeth, standing at court in Whitehall, watched the news arrive in dispatches delivered by torchlight. To mark the victory, she transformed the entire realm into a hall of celebration. Commemorative medals bearing her effigy and the inscription, "God blew and they were scattered," were struck in gold and silver. Poets crafted verses extolling her name. Painters captured the drama of burning ships on vast canvases that hung in her private galleries. Across England, church bells pealed, streets were strewn with flowers, and feasts lasted for days. What had been a near cataclysm became a triumph that bound the nation ever tighter to her cause. In defeating the greatest naval power of the era, Elizabeth Tudor revealed not only her strategic brilliance, but also her capacity to marshal every resource, sea, land, and mind, on behalf of her people. Through cunning espionage, rigid control of her public persona, and a masterstroke of leadership in the face of invasion, she solidified England's security and elevated her realm's prestige. In the wake of that fateful year, the Tudor dynasty entered what historians would call its Golden Age, a time when literature, exploration, and prosperity bloomed under the watchful, unsleeping gaze of a queen who had woven safety and image into an inseparable tapestry of power. Under Elizabeth I's rule, England drifted into what later scholars would call the Elizabethan Age, a season of culture so luminous that it seemed to glow even in the greyest London fog. As the decade of 1560 dawned, the boards of the stage sprang to life, and with them came the name of William Shakespeare, whose plays Hamlet, Macbeth, A Midsummer Night's Dream would shape the very soul of English drama. Though a few worrywarts in the Privy Council fretted that theatre might corrupt the youth, Elizabeth herself saw the stage as a kind of gentle dominion. When subjects were lost in the tangled plots of kings and ghosts, they pondered less the riotous world outside. She quietly underwrote touring companies, sending funds to patch leaky roofs, and install benches in ramshackle playhouses, so that even provincial towns could taste the wonder of a passionate monologue or a tragic fall. As the footlights warmed actors' faces, poets too took to their quills in concerted fervour. Edmund Spenser spun verse lauding his queen as Gloriana, a living goddess whose wisdom and purity illuminated the realm. In softly lit chambers, Sir Philip Sidney composed Arcadia, weaving subtle philosophy into pastoral romance, and lending the airs of courtly elegance to his lines. These manuscripts, circulated with the approval of Elizabeth's librarians, spread like fire in dry reeds. Private schools feathered their shelves with these volumes, and fledgling scholars pored over metaphors of virtue and glory late into the night, their candle flames guttering as they practiced penning their own couplets. Neither art nor poetry ruled alone under Elizabeth's watch. She turned her gaze to the wild blue depths beyond England's shores, encouraging daring voyages that filled her coffers and charted new maps of the world. Sir Francis Drake slipped the bonds of Plymouth Harbour and returned, 3 years later, laden with gold dust, curious artifacts, and marvels of navigation. His tales of distant seas fueled the public's imagination, and Drake became something like a national hero whose very name carried the promise of adventure. Not to be outdone, Sir Walter Raleigh sketched plans for settlements across the Atlantic, envisioning colonies in North America that would expand England's reach and promise fortunes in tobacco and timber. Though some critics grumbled at the expense, Elizabeth recognized that these expeditions enriched the sciences of cartography and seamanship, and she quietly sanctioned further voyages on the strength of the knowledge they yielded. Throughout these triumphs of art, literature, and exploration, Elizabeth I maintained a singular, unblinking oversight of her realm's message. Every diplomatic letter, every public speech, even the smallest press announcement passed beneath her watchful gaze. Scribes and secretaries submitted their drafts to her personal review, and few dared to deviate from the tone she approved. Thus emerged a monarchy whose public voice was unerringly consistent. Every decree felt stamped with the same authority. Every poem in praise of the Queen bore her subtle imprimatur. Honours and titles were doled out with exquisite selectiveness. A peerage here, a knighthood there, always reminding the nobility that favour was a gift carefully granted, not a right to be assumed. Within the walls of Whitehall, Elizabeth's court became more than a seat of governance. It transformed into a true salon of the mind and spirit. Courtiers gathered in candlelit galleries to hear the latest sonnet, or to examine charts newly drawn by returning navigators. In one chamber, a young scholar might debate Aristotle's ethics. In another, a shipwright might display a brass sextant brought from the New World. These intersections of art, science, and politics gave Elizabeth's reign its unique shimmer. She was, in effect, both playwright and patron, admiral and architect of ideas. And so it was that the Queen's subtle blend of hard power and soft influence bound the nation together. While musketeers drilled on musty parade grounds and ships launched from creaking docks, the life of the mind pulsed invisibly through tavern rooms and private studies. England, once a fractured kingdom torn by religious strife, found unity in these shared pursuits. Theatres echoed with laughter and tears, libraries filled with scrapings of ink on vellum, docks rang with the cries of sailors casting off toward uncharted horizons. All of it rested upon Elizabeth's quiet resolve to merge political authority with cultural stewardship. This living tapestry of creativity and inquiry did not wither when the Queen finally laid down her crown. Long after her presence faded, the spirit of her court continued to animate English architecture, music, and verse. Stately homes were built with galleries intended for verse recitals. Church organs echoed with new compositions. Maps drawn in her era became the basis for future cartographers' work. Even centuries later, scholars talk of a golden thread running from Westminster Abbey to the New World, spun first by Elizabeth's careful hand. Thus, as soft candlelight fell upon parchments, and as ships tacked across storm-tossed seas, England in Elizabeth's time became a stage upon which the whole world watched. It was a realm ruled not by force alone, but by the subtle power of ideas, where the Queen, cloaked in velvet and wisdom, guided her people with the gentle authority of a patron of every noble pursuit. In the hush that followed each public proclamation, one could almost hear the whisper of her guiding maxim, that the truest power lies not only in the might of armies, or the weight of gold, but in the enduring strength of culture, exploration, and a well-turned phrase. Though she never married, Elizabeth I did not live wholly without affection. In fact, the closest bond she ever allowed herself was with Robert Dudley, the later Earl of Leicester. He had been her companion since childhood, a constant presence in corridors and gardens, tall and handsome, with a restless intelligence and a hunger for advancement. Over countless evenings in candlelit chambers, they had shared confidences that no one else could claim, and in time the court whispered that theirs was more than simple loyalty. When Dudley's wife died under peculiar circumstances falling down the stairs at court, some said, while others implied darker designs, the rumours grew so loud and persistent that they threatened to drown out every other courtly murmur. Yet Elizabeth, in her gentle, sleepy way, did not recoil. Rather, she drew Dudley closer still, rewarding him with lands and offices that made him one of England's wealthiest nobles, while carefully never permitting a wedding ceremony to bind them in that most final of bonds. Her strategy was subtle. If ambassadors from France arrived in London with anxious hearts, she might send Dudley to greet them with gracious words, his presence meant to soothe and charm. When envoys from Spain passed through her court, she would seat him at lavish feasts, draped in finery that spoke of England's power and prestige. In each case, Dudley played his part as both favourite and enigma, never her husband, yet never far from her side. His ambiguous status became a form of leverage. Would he someday wear the crown? Might her heart compel her to set aside duty for love? These questions hovered in the minds of foreign diplomats, like candles flickering in a draughty hall, uncertain whether the flame would hold or sputter out. For the noblemen of England, this arrangement was both a hope and a headache. Some whispered in dark corners that England could count on a stable royal relationship at last, that the Queen's affection for Dudley would bring unity to a fractious court. Others fretted that Dudley's arrogance and ambition would warp policy, that he would steer the realm toward his own ends rather than hers. More than once, Elizabeth found herself issuing decrees that reminded ambassadors and courtiers alike that her personal preferences did not, could not, dictate the laws of the land. When agents from foreign powers pressed her on the question of marriage, she would lean back on her throne, cloak pooling around her ankles, and murmur with a hint of a yawn, "I have reigned long without bearer of child. What cause have I to hasten such matters now?" In refusing to take Dudley as husband, Elizabeth taught Europe a lesson in the power of no commitment. By nurturing a relationship that was at once intimate and unsealed, she left both allies and rivals suspended in expectation. They found themselves offering her gifts, plotting alliances, and negotiating terms, all in the hope of becoming Dudley's rival or co-conspirator in her affections and thereby winning political favour. Yet each letter that bore Dudley's name arrived only with a courteous note from Elizabeth, promising nothing beyond continued goodwill. Power, she demonstrated, was not diminished by the absence of ceremony. Rather, it was intensified by the open question of what might come to pass. For Leicester himself, the dance was finely tuned. At times, he would bow low before the Queen, whispering assurances of his loyalty, accepting new titles with pale courtesy. At others, he would stand apart, arms folded, allowing the echo of uncertainty to circle the court like a slow, drifting fog. In that space between devotion and denial, Dudley became the living emblem of Elizabeth's sovereignty, the one man closest to her heart, yet never granted enough to claim it wholly. When ministers grew restless, pressing for her to secure the realm with a dynastic marriage, Elizabeth's resolve did not waver. She would remind them of the long years she had already ruled without handing over power to a consort, her voice soft but firm. "I have borne England's throne for years without the pain of childbirth. What need have I now to endure such trials? Better is the certainty of my own mind than the bonds of wedlock." Thus, she reaffirmed that her reign was her own, not the joint enterprise of a queen and her husband. Through her unofficial partnership with Dudley, Elizabeth turned matrimony into a diplomatic tool. By keeping the possibility of closer union indefinitely suspended, she ensured that no foreign prince could rest securely, that every potential suitor remained eager yet cautious. Her court became a stage on which treaties were whispered, embassies flattered, and favours bartered, all under the subtle, ever-present question of whether she might at last seal the bargain in marriage. Yet marriage never came, and that unanswered question became her greatest instrument of negotiation. Allies were drawn toward her, intrigued by the promise of intimacy, while adversaries hesitated, unsure whether to press their demands or risk displeasing a queen whose private affections could prove as perilous as any fleet. In the end, Elizabeth's mastery of the uncommitted liaison with Dudley was nothing short of a masterclass in political artifice. She illuminated for Europe the potency of restraint, that genuine attachment need not lead to permanent obligation, that standing apart could confer just as much sway as binding oneself. By refusing to wed, she underscored her own supremacy over the royal script, proving that the throne's chief occupant need not marry to solidify her power. Instead, she could harness desire itself, channeling it into the machinery of statecraft. In that quiet, unspoken way, she demonstrated a truth as deep and enduring as any treaty, that sovereignty rests not merely in crowns or vows, but in the tantalizing space between promise and refusal, in the gentle power of perhaps, rather than the finality of I do. Entering her 60th year, a stage of life that, in the 16th century, was commonly regarded as the onset of old age, Elizabeth showed no sign of yielding to time's gentle knock. She wore wigs piled high, their curls and plaits so intricate they could house small birds. Her gowns were so heavy that even the strongest noblemen might wince to see how she bore their weight with ease. A thick mask of white lead paint coated her face, lending her features a spectral pallor that made her presence at court all the more uncanny. In tense council sessions, if a courtier spoke out of turn, she might hurl a glove or boot in their direction, and none dared return it. The younger lords would shrink back at her icy glare, and foreign ambassadors, upon arriving, found themselves rehearsing every phrase, every tilt of the head, lest they commit some minor infraction that might draw Elizabeth's ever-watchful eye. As her health gradually declined, an inevitable accompaniment of advancing years, Elizabeth adamantly refused to surrender herself to bed rest. She believed that once she lay down, she might never rise again. So she spent the final months of her reign standing or perched stiffly on a plain wooden chair, the sense of duty outweighing every ache in her bones. Her physicians and ladies-in-waiting hovered anxiously about her, offering cushions and gentle advice. Yet she would limp to her desk each morning, flick her gaunt hand through a stack of dispatches, and insist on reading every report and signing each deed with the same deliberate precision she had maintained for decades. Even at the point when breath came in shallow wisps and her vision blurred at the edges, the governance ritual persisted, reviewing muster rolls, approving the day's expenditures, and only then, with a faint nod, permitting herself the mild indulgence of a simple luncheon. Over the course of nearly 45 years on the throne, Elizabeth never once formally endorsed a successor. When courtiers and bishops pressed her for the name of her heir, she would arch a single aristocratic eyebrow, lift a hand in mock surrender, and quip in that soft, lulling voice, "Are you all not planning to remove me yourselves, so that you might assume the crown?" The ambiguity she cultivated was no mere jest. It was a form of statecraft. By keeping the question of succession suspended, she ensured that every nobleman remained vigilant, never slipping into complacency, all the while uncertain whether the call to London might be a summons to council or a summons to coronation. At last, in the spring of 1603, Elizabeth's long vigil came to an end. The great Tudor line shuttered with her passing, and her corpse, drained of life but still draped in silks and pearls, lay upon the dais of Whitehall. When asked what legacy she intended to leave, the Queen offered no formal testament of lands or titles, but rather proclaimed shouldered, and voice faint yet resolute, that she left behind a bag of experience. Lessons in ruling fiercely against foes, generously toward her people, deftly in diplomacy, and never ceding an inch of her authority. This invisible will prove its power when James VI of Scotland, the distant prince whom she had long alluded to in veiled references, stepped forward to claim England's throne. The new king, learning from Elizabeth's unspoken edicts, preserved Parliament's privileges, tempered religious strife, and maintained the formidable navy she had so carefully nurtured. Elizabeth departed not with the ostentation of gilt carriages and grand funerary rites, but more like a statue erected amid history's ebb and flow, steadfast, unbowed, forever gripping her own balance of power. In her slow decline, she demonstrated the final, enduring truth of her reign, that sovereignty resides not merely in pomp or ceremony, but in the quiet mastery of presence itself. And when her name echoes through the corridors of time, it is less the gilded crown we recall than the unyielding posture of a ruler who, even in her final breaths, refused to recline. One of Elizabeth's most carefully nurtured secrets of power lay in her uncanny ability to transform every minute detail of court life into an image of unassailable authority. She strictly forbade any public appearance devoid of her signature mask of white lead makeup, ensuring that her face, smooth and unlined, resembled a lifelike wax effigy rather than a mortal woman. This pallid visage, untouched by the ravages of time and imperfection, created an illusion of immortality that neither birth nor age could tarnish. Her wigs, towering and meticulously arranged, added inches to her stature, while the farthingales beneath her gowns broadened her shoulders into a silhouette nearly as imposing as her reputation. Thus did the Queen, small in physical stature yet solid in presence, loom over each gathering with the gravity of fate itself. Courtiers, no matter how wealthy or indebted they were, dared not imitate her appearance. Even if they could afford the most sumptuous silks and the costliest foreign jewels, they maintained the respectful distance her royal sumptuary laws demanded. Equally strict was Elizabeth's regulation of her own likeness in portraiture. Every painted image, from the delicate miniature sketches by Nicholas Hilliard to the grand oil panels once attributed to Hans Holbein's Circle, had to conform precisely to her royal template. No fluttering eyelash, no broad grin permitted. Her gaze was always steady, her lips a demure line that suggested both composure and warning. Artists laboured under her exacting eye, retouching each canvas until it matched the Queen's vision of perfection. An ageless, statuesque woman whose very image broadcast power and separation. These portraits, once approved, were circulated far and wide in illustrated books, printed engravings, and painted copies sent to foreign courts, becoming an early form of political Photoshop, imprinting Elizabeth's mythic presence across Europe. Every subject who glimpsed these likenesses recognized at once that they were looking not merely at a monarch, but at an idea, sovereignty made visible. The rituals of Elizabeth's court were choreographed with the same meticulous attention. State funerals, ambassadorial receptions, and investiture ceremonies all followed detailed scripts that guided each movement, each curtsy, and each spoken greeting. Pages and courtiers rehearsed endlessly in the palace corridors, ensuring that when the day arrived, the solemn procession trumpets heralding the approach, falcon feather plumes atop the gowns, and the slow cadence of embroidered trains moved with stately precision. Even foreign envoys from distant realms, such as Rome's sacred halls or the Sultan's court, arrived expecting spectacle, and found themselves awed by English pageantry. No gesture was left to chance. Every bowed head and whispered, "Your Majesty," served to reinforce the aura of ritualized deference that sustained Elizabeth's supremacy. Beyond visual splendor, Elizabeth wielded music as another potent instrument of her psychological fortress. At chapter house concerts and state banquets, a consort of viols and lutes would weave haunting melodies that floated through the vaults of Whitehall, while choirs of voices, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, lifted hymns of loyalty and praise to Gloriana, the poetic moniker bestowed upon the Virgin Queen. Lyrics hailed her as the shining star of Britain, guardian of faith, and exemplar of beauty, and each refrain echoed off marble columns and tapestry-draped walls, embedding her legend in ear and heart alike. These compositions were not confined to the palace. During celebrations of military triumph or the nuptials of favoured nobles, the same anthems swelled through the streets, uplifting commoners' spirits and sending a subtle message to any would-be conspirators that all of England sang her praise. By weaving together these layers of spectacle, her sculpted visage, her carefully regulated portraiture, her orchestrated ceremonies, and her stirring court music, Elizabeth constructed a psychological bulwark that deterred both foreign invaders and domestic rebels. No armada, no cavalcade of insurgents, dared to imagine that they could overturn a regime so thoroughly anchored in symbolic power. She demonstrated, time and again, that soft authority, the power of image, ritual, and emotion, could withstand and even surpass the blunt force of armies. In the hush that followed each procession, in the silence broken only by viol consorts and choir refrains, her subjects and ambassadors alike recognized the truth of her rule, that in every breath of ceremony, in every note of music, and in every flawless brushstroke, Elizabeth I had woven a tapestry of power so complete that it seemed born not of any one queen, but of the very soul of England itself. When Elizabeth I died, she left behind far more than the Tudor dynasty. She bequeathed to posterity a masterful blueprint for leadership that wove together hard power, naval might, intelligence networks and soft power culture, imagery while guarding her personal independence and mastering the art of diplomatic hesitation. In the hush that followed her passing, her subjects and foreign observers alike would come to recognize 4 lasting pillars of her reign, each one as quietly formidable as the others. First, Elizabeth's vision laid the very foundation for England's rise as a naval superpower. During her 44 years on the throne, her navy evolved from a modest coastal defence force into the Elizabethan fleet that came to dominate the Atlantic. Small, agile ships, armed with the latest cannon, patrolled the sea lanes, harried enemy vessels, and protected burgeoning trade routes. Those same vessels carried explorers westward across the Azores, into the Caribbean, along the coast of North America, planting the seeds of England's first colonies. These footholds, once established, would grow over 2 centuries into the vast network of commerce and colonial possessions that defined the British Empire of the 19th century. What began as daring voyages under Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake matured into a global maritime infrastructure, one in which English merchants, sailors and soldiers would come to ply every ocean, trade with every continent, and ultimately knit together a Britannia rules the waves world order that transformed not only England, but the very nature of global interaction. Second, Elizabeth fostered a cultural renaissance whose echoes still reverberate through literature and drama. Under her patronage, the English stage blossomed into a phenomenon the world had never seen, with playwrights such as William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, and Christopher Marlowe elevating the English language to new heights of poetry, philosophy, and human drama. Shakespeare's tragedies and comedies, from Hamlet's existential soliloquies to the midnight revelries of A Midsummer Night's Dream, became the spiritual and intellectual landscape of Elizabethan England. Spenser's epic poetry painted her as Gloriana, the virgin goddess of a new golden age, while Marlowe's bold dramas challenged conventions and probed the darker recesses of ambition and desire. These works circulated in printed quartos and folios, performed in inn-yards and courts alike, teaching generations of readers and audiences to think in iambic pentameter, to savour metaphor and melody, and to see their own lives reflected in the triumphs and tragedies enshrined on the stage. Even now, over 400 years later, scholars, actors, and dreamers across the globe draw sustenance from that spring of creativity, proving Elizabeth's belief that soft power of art could hold unruly hearts and minds more effectively than any decree or edict. Third, the intelligence apparatus she nurtured under the watchful eye of Sir Francis Walsingham stands as the remarkable forebear of modern espionage services such as MI6. Walsingham's network of spies, interceptors of letters, codebreakers, and undercover agents formed a clandestine lattice that penetrated the darkest plots against the throne, whether Catholic conspiracies, assassination attempts, or foreign meddling. This secret service operated with a discipline and discretion unmatched in its time. Missives were opened, ciphers crypted, and traitors unmasked, well before their schemes could come to fruition. That system not only safeguarded Elizabeth's person, but also set a standard for statecraft that other nations would soon emulate, institutionalizing covert operations, counterintelligence, and cryptanalysis as indispensable tools of national security. The silent footfalls of Walsingham's agents through London's alleys and Europe's courts taught future empires that the unseen hand of intelligence could be as decisive a weapon as any broadside cannon. Finally, and perhaps most subtly of all, Elizabeth's greatest inheritance was a lesson in personal sovereignty. From her refusal to wed to her insistence on overseeing every royal missive and decree, she demonstrated that a ruler need never cede ultimate authority. By deftly employing marital negotiations as diplomatic bargaining chips, courting suitors from Spain, France, and Sweden only to leave them dangling, she kept England's alliances fluid and her own throne unchallenged. Inside her Privy Council, no minister rose too far beyond her favour. Rewards were doled out sparingly, demands answered after calculated delay, and every supplicant learned that their queen's goodwill was as precious as it was unpredictable. In this way, Elizabeth taught that true power lay in maintaining one's independence, in mastering the art of deliberate ambiguity, and in ensuring that no one ever spoke or acted without the thought of her silent gaze. There are, of course, shadows to that legacy: her harsh measures against Catholic dissenters, her strict sumptuary laws that reinforced social hierarchies, and the loneliness of a life lived always on guard. Yet history has judged that the gains far outweighed the costs. Elizabeth I transformed a beleaguered island into a beacon of wealth and innovation. She forged a cultural identity that endures in every reading of Shakespeare's verse. And she built systems of naval command and secret intelligence that underpinned Britain's global preeminence for centuries to come. In the hushed corridors of Westminster Abbey, where her coffin rested beneath a simple tomb, and in the bustle of the Thames-side docks where her ships once set sail into the unknown, Elizabeth's presence lingers still. Her reign, a tapestry of force and finesse, remains one of history's most compelling testimonies to the power of a single sovereign to reshape the destiny of a nation and, in so doing, to offer each subsequent generation a blueprint for leadership that combines the steely resolve of hard power with the subtle grace of soft influence. And so, even as the last candles gutter in the royal chapels and the minstrels of Whitehall fall silent, her stratagems and her stories continue to whisper across the ages that true authority belongs to those who master both sword and sonnet, both shadow and spotlight, and who never relinquish the reins of their own destiny. And now, having followed the dramatic and powerful journey of Queen Elizabeth I through every twist and turn of her reign, we are about to venture into a less often mentioned but truly chilling aspect. 10 horrifying truths about Elizabeth I that not everyone knows. These anecdotes reveal an extremely dark side behind the Virgin Crown, where power was defended through vicious plots, psychological torture, and ruthless schemes of destruction. Brace yourself, for each upcoming truth will send shivers down your spine whenever her name is spoken. Terrifying truth number 1. The execution of the secret lover. Under the flicker of pale yellow torchlight in the stillness of a midnight atmosphere, the tale of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, still sends shivers down one's spine. Elizabeth Tudor, celebrated as the Virgin Queen, was scarcely expected to order the slaughter of her most trusted confidant. Essex, a royal favourite cherished beyond measure, had been Elizabeth's closest friend throughout the decade of 1590. Beneath their affectionate veneer lay a fierce thirst for power. He dreamed of ruling England himself, believing he could supplant her throne. In the year 1600, Essex masterminded a rebellion, conspiring to overthrow the crown, a treason so grave it brooked no mercy. When rumours of secession and insurrection reached the Queen's ears, her heart tightened in anguished betrayal. It was not merely political treachery, but a personal wound, for the one she loved most had plotted her downfall. Rather than grant him a quiet death in obscurity, Elizabeth chose to display her authority through a public trial at the Tower of London, a place that had witnessed the executions of many royal figures. Essex, once lavished with opulent estates, jewelled ornaments, and exalted titles, now faced unrelenting justice. On February 25th, 1601, thousands of Londoners pressed against the cold stone walls to witness the horrifying spectacle. Chroniclers estimate over 5,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder, the wind stilled only by the hush of anticipation, ears straining to catch the rustle of long cloaks and the bone-chilling groan of the swinging axe. Amid swirling mist, each candle flame trembled like a heartbeat waiting to be snuffed out. When the blade descended, Essex uttered a faint cry and fell silent. His life ended in a single, brutal instant. That grim scene seared itself into the memory of every witness and most of all into Elizabeth's mind. As her lover's lifeless body was draped in black cloth and incense smoke curled through the air, she dared not lift her gaze to the heavens, instead staring intently at the fallen traitor. Though a cold wind whipped through her regal robes, her heart burned with righteous fury and steely resolve to maintain her throne. Her health, already waning with the years, did little to deter her from remaining visible to the public as long as possible, to demonstrate that anyone who dared betray her would pay with blood and breath. News of Essex's execution echoed across Europe. Envoys and diplomats carried the dreadful account back to Paris, Madrid, Rome, serving as a stark warning. Do not underestimate the power of the woman who wore the Tudor crown. In the depths of night, as wind whispered along ancient stones, the story of Essex reminded future generations of a harsh truth. Love and power cannot always coexist. This was the final blow to any hope of personal reconciliation, and the clearest admonition, an enduring lesson in authority and the horror hidden beneath the Virgin Queen's crown. And now, drifting from the cold steel of the executioner's axe to a darker corner of Elizabeth's rule, we arrive at another chilling method she perfected in silence. Terrifying truth number 2. The damp dungeon and psychological torture. In the hush that follows a storm, one might almost hear the drip of water on mossy stone, and in such settings Elizabeth I found her most insidious tool of control. Whenever the Queen suspected a courtier, noble, or even a royal-born woman of treachery, she personally ordered them consigned to the dank vaults beneath her castles, prisons where moisture clung to the walls like breath, and only the barest slits of daylight pierced the darkness. These subterranean cells were neither bright enough for the sun to warm, nor dry enough to stave off mildew. And here, in this realm of perpetual gloom, captives were left untethered to any schedule of meal or rest, sometimes for months on end, even years. Imagine a soul confined to an underground chamber where each breath tastes of cold mud and rotting plaster. No lash of the whip, no clank of iron shackles marked their suffering. Instead, they endured the pure torment of solitude. Day after day, guards slid beneath the cell door a crust of stale bread and a cup of foul, murky water, then vanished back into the corridors of stone. Beyond that door, the echoes of distant footsteps and muted voices only served to deepen the prisoners' resolve to belong once more to the waking world. Without the sun's rhythms to guide them, their circadian clocks unravelled. Hours melted into days, days into weeks, and the mind began to fray. According to court annals, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, once found herself confined in such a wet cell at Buxton under Elizabeth's orders before her public execution. Though her body emerged unharmed by steel or rod, the relentless isolation and bone-chilling dampness shattered her will. Over time, Mary confessed to plots she had never conceived, simply to silence the ceaseless questions from unseen interrogators. Others perished quietly from infections and respiratory ailments that claimed them faster than any blade, their cries muffled by the thick stone walls. Yet Elizabeth never paid a grain of ransom for their upkeep. She knew well that a cold, dark cell and the gradual erosion of hope were the cheapest means of compliance. This practice became a hidden formula of governance. Never deliver an outright death sentence, but instead engineer a living death beneath layers of gloom. After the Buxton incident, few dared whisper Mary Stuart's name in Elizabeth's presence, for the very thought of isolation's horror was enough to compel obedience. And it was not only foreign queens who learned this lesson. English nobles, ministers and ladies, brought close to the throne, all felt the shadow of that dank dungeon, looming over every misplaced word or curious glance. So, as we drift from public spectacle of the Tower to the silent agony of the underground vaults, remember that in Elizabeth's court, the mind was as much a battleground as the open field. The horror of sunlight never touching one's face, the dread of time losing all meaning, and the gnawing certainty that no aid would ever arrive. This was the true weapon of the Virgin Queen, and it remains one of her queerest and most terrifying legacies, the absolute knowledge that even without a drop of blood spilled by another's hand, a sovereign could crush spirit and sanity with mere darkness and damp. Drifting from the unseen horrors of solitude and isolation, we now turn our weary gaze to an equally macabre relic hidden in plain sight. Terrifying truth. Number 3. The unveiling of the Queen's skull. One of the most ghastly legends uncovered by later generations is the story of the Elizabeth skull, a sombre wooden casket engraved with the letters Elizabeth Regina, said to contain the very skull of the late Queen after her. Peaceful passing. In keeping with her own decree that no tombstone should bear her name, Elizabeth I was interred quietly beneath an unmarked grave in Westminster Abbey. Her body was laid to rest with minimal ceremony, the aisle kept silent and dark in her memory. Then, in the year 1789, during restoration works beneath the stone floor, labourers stumbled upon a lockable wooden chest concealed beneath the tiled pavement. This chest could only be opened by the very priest who had overseen the Queen's original burial rites. When they finally unfastened the rusted clasp, they beheld a woman's skull, its jawbone still intact, the teeth gleaming like tiny white pearls. The eye sockets lay empty. As all skulls must. Yet those voids seemed to hold the very weight of Elizabeth's unyielding gaze. Believers quickly accepted this as her remains, and the box was transferred to the British Museum, displayed beside the remnants of her white gloves and a pair of delicate bracelets she once wore to court. Decades later, a forensic anthropologist undertook DNA testing on the skull, comparing its genetic profile to that of confirmed descendants of Edward I. To the astonishment of many, the results failed to match. Some speculated that the skull might actually belong to another noblewoman, misplaced under the abbey's shadowy floors. Yet it was this very secrecy, the concealment of her final resting place in a private crypt, the absence of any marked gravestone, that fueled the chilling legend. The skull of England's most formidable monarch now lay entombed in a dingy wooden box, accompanied only by the whispers of history. The decision to exhibit the skull, albeit shrouded in dim lighting and seldom mentioned in official guides, cast an eerie spell over museum visitors. An object once wielding imperial authority, that had gazed down from royal portraits in sumptuous gowns, was reduced to an anonymous cranium. Hundreds of years after her demise, travellers still shudder at the sight of that modest artifact case, feeling the fragile and merciless turns of dynastic fate. Imagine, standing before a glass display, your eyes tracing the rough-hewn wood of the box, the carved letters that once proclaimed, "Elizabeth Regina." You sense the chill of centuries pressing in as you contemplate the empty sockets of power's former vessel. No longer does the Queen command armies or councils. Her last vestige is a bone that once supported a brilliant mind and an iron will. The hush in the gallery seems unbroken, carrying the echo of a sovereign who once declared, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," only to reveal in death that her bones too command reverence. So, if you ever find yourself wandering the dim corridors of the British Museum, be mindful of the hush around one particular exhibit. There, behind a quiet label and a single shaft of spotlight, rests the sketched outline of a monarch's mortal remains. It is a stark reminder that even queens must ultimately yield to the grave, leaving behind only memories, and perhaps a skull in a wooden casket, to whisper of the power they once held. Drifting from the silent chambers where the Queen's very bones lay in wait, we now return to the beating heart of the court, where even a simple banquet could hide a deadly trap. Terrifying truth number 4. The poisoning plots at court. If there is one lesson to carry forward from the macabre revelation of Elizabeth's skull, it is that nothing in her world remained as it appeared. Within the gilded halls of her court, countless conspiracies stirred behind velvet drapes, and none were more insidious than the attempts at poisoning. According to the secret records of Francis Walsingham's intelligence service, in the decades spanning 1580 to 1590, at least 3 separate plots sought to deliver tainted pastries or poison-laced beverages to the unsuspecting Queen. The most harrowing of these conspiracies unfolded in the year 1593, during the lavish feast celebrating the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Bernardino de Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador, cunningly concealed arsenic within sweet pastries and fine vintage wine intended for Elizabeth I. Under the gentle glow of candelabra, a platter of flaky confections passed from hand to hand, all destined for the royal table. Yet Walsingham's network of spies, whose watchful eyes extended even to the shadowed arches of London Bridge, intercepted whispers of Mendoza's plan. Agents stealthily confiscated every last cake, decanted every drop of the wine before it could touch the Queen's lips. In order to confirm the lethality of the poison, Walsingham conducted cruel experiments on a pair of unwitting donkeys, feeding them a sample of the suspected cakes. Within hours, the poor creatures writhed in agony, their muscles convulsing until they lay still. This gruesome proof galvanized the court into immediate action. Elizabeth remained blissfully unaware as her entire set of goblets and knives was replaced, and the water supply to Whitehall was boiled and purified. Henceforth, the Queen resorted to porcelain goblets, stamped with her personal emblem, and sipped only Dutch chamomile tea, reputed for its purity and imported at great expense from the Low Countries. But the threat of poison was not confined to Her Majesty alone. Princes and princesses, lords and ladies, all dined under looming suspicion. In 1597, tragedy struck when a beloved courtier fell ill after preparing a sumptuous banquet for one of the royal princesses. Within days, he succumbed to his symptoms, violent fever and excruciating cramps, revealing that even those who served the Queen faced mortal peril. The incident laid bare the savage undercurrents of the royal stage, where competition for favour could swiftly turn from a whispered intrigue into a lethal ambush. This persistent shadow of danger forced Elizabeth to yield to constant vigilance. Each meal was now an exercise in ritual. The Queen herself performed a brief inspection of every dish, accompanied by a silent prayer, while her trusted attendants watched for the slightest discoloration or odd odour. Dinner parties, once an opportunity for spectacle and merriment, became tense affairs, with guests nibbling at morsels as though handling fragile relics, ever mindful of the invisible threat that might lurk within. And so, within those ornate chambers, the game of power assumed its cruelest guise. Weapons need not glint in the late afternoon sun. A fork dusted with powder was enough to sow chaos. Courtiers learned to laugh politely as they nibbled at cold meat, eyes darting to the Queen's table to see if she would show the slightest sign of distress. Champagne corks popped overhead, but behind each toast lay the unspoken understanding that survival depended upon the swift detection of betrayal. In the hushed corridors, rumours of bitter draughts and purple stains on crumbs passed like ghosts, haunting even the bravest soul. By the time the sun set on the 16th century, Elizabeth's court had forged a new protocol: never trust the hospitality of friend or stranger, and always keep a cup of water simmering at the edge of the table to cleanse the palate, or perhaps to dilute a darker poison that might drift unknowingly your way. And so we leave the banquet hall behind, its opulent tapestries laden with hidden menace, to journey onward through the Queen's darker mysteries. Drifting from the poisoned feasts that turned convivial halls into danger zones, we now slip into the most private and unforeseen chamber of all, where even the Queen's solitude was laced with lethal intent. Terrifying truth number 5. The cyanide, soaked bath conspiracy. In the aftermath of those chilling schemes at the royal table, one might imagine there was nowhere left for intrigue to hide. Yet, Elizabeth I reserved her most elaborate precaution for the sanctum, where she shed her regal robes and sought a moment's repose. Her personal bathing chamber at Whitehall Palace was encircled by sentries and accessible only to a handful of her most devoted ladies in waiting. No architect, artisan or courtier dared enter without direct invitation. And so, centuries slipped by before a curious scholar revisited the original blueprints and made a bone-chilling discovery. Beneath the inlaid marble tiles of the tub's foundation lay a concealed network of pipes, 2 discrete circuits running parallel like silent sentinels. One carried fresh water, the other channeled away refuse. But between those benign conduits lay a hidden third line, its purpose inscrutable to all but the architect who inserted it. It was capped, sealed, and utterly invisible to every cautious eye. When 20th century chemical experts managed to extract a minute sample of the residual liquid still clinging within that secret tube, the findings were gruesomely precise. Traces of cyanide, the same nerve toxin so deadly it could kill in an instant. Historians now theorize that Elizabeth commissioned this sinister apparatus as her ultimate insurance policy, should betrayals swarm too close, or if despair ever consumed her regal heart, she could simply summarily release the cyanide into her bathwater and end her life on her own terms. The notion that a sovereign would prepare for such a final act of self-destruction in the confines of her most private retreat is enough to unsettle the steeliest mind. Yet archival fragments buried in the royal papers corroborate parts of this dark tale. A secret warrant bearing the Queen's faint signature, authorizing the import of pure cyanide from Spain, where poisoners had long mastered its refinement. No record ever indicates that Elizabeth contemplated suicide in earnest. Still, the very existence of this clandestine plumbing system reveals the depth of her vigilant paranoia. She would brook no betrayal, even as she stood at the apex of power, She anticipated death as a potential final adversary. By embedding a death trap in the chamber where she sought refreshment and repose, she ensured that the last decision, should it come, remained hers alone. Imagine the silent click of a brass valve concealed behind the marble, a single twist sending toxin cascading into the steaming waters. In that moment, the sacrament of the bath, once a reprieve from the world's weight, would morph into a tomb. The thought clings like dampness to the mind. The Queen of England, garbed in pearls and velvet by day, but at night potentially steeling herself in that eerie sanctuary, a hidden mechanism at her fingertips. Visitors to the ruins of Whitehall now tread lightly near the site, believed to house this morbid contrivance. Underfoot, the stones might still conceal the grooves of those pipes. No guidebook mentions it, no plaque marks the spot. But to those who know the legend, the very memory of Elizabeth's cyanide conduit becomes a haunting echo of her absolute command, even over the manner and moment of her own death. Thus, in the end, the Virgin Queen's vigilance extended beyond armies, plots and poisons at court. She seemed to trust no power greater than her own will, not even fate. And it is this final revelation, the concealed cyanide-soaked bath, that paints her legacy in the darkest shades of caution and control. Drift now from these corridors of mortality, carrying with you the hushed dread that even solitude bore the mark of her formidable reign. And now, having explored the hidden cyanide conduit beneath her bath, our weary journey leads us back into the dazzling yet deadly realm of Tudor ornament. Terrifying truth number 6. The poisoned pearl. Murder via jewellery. After uncovering the Queen's secret cyanide-infused sanctuary, one might imagine that no trinket in her court could be trusted. Yet, in the late 1580s, even the glittering baubles meant to adorn Elizabeth I concealed the most insidious of threats. Among her closest attendants was General Bess Swynnerton, a steadfast aide who served at the Queen's side through countless intrigues. One cool autumn morning, Swynnerton accepted a gift, a delicate pearl pendant from an unidentified Italian nobleman. The tiny lustrous orb at its centre glimmered with promise, but within days the loyal courtier lay convulsing on the cold stone floor of her chamber. Initially, Swynnerton complained of dizziness and profound fatigue. She strove to steady herself, but soon the episodes grew violent. Muscles spasmed uncontrollably, and her breath came in strangled gasps until she collapsed, never to rise again. Alarm rippled through the palace. The Queen's own physicians insisted upon a close examination of the fatal pendant. Peering through magnifying lenses of polished crystal, they discovered a fine white powder clinging to the pendant's reverse side. Sothin it required the gentle brushing of a squirrel hairbrush to reveal in full. In accordance with 16th century pharmacology, they recognized this dust as a refined form of arsenic, a colorless, odorless nerve toxin easily absorbed through the skin. The revelation sent shockwaves through Westminster. Elizabeth herself had never worn that ill-fated gift, yet she commanded an immediate recall of every imported pearl and gemstone within the palace. Cartloads of jewelled necklaces, diamond rings, and jewelled hairpins were dispatched to the royal treasury, where they were sealed within the deepest vault. There, under flickering torchlight, a cadre of vigilant chambermaids laboured for nights without rest. Each delicate piece was swabbed with vinegar, roasted embers, and a dilute lime-wash solution to detect any traces of arsenic or other heavy metals. The hissing reaction of metal against acid became the nightly refrain of anxious guardianship. Whispers later pointed to a covert network of Italian courtiers, long antagonistic toward Elizabeth's Protestant realm, as orchestrators of the plot. Their aim was to eliminate the Virgin Queen quietly, shattering English unity and plunging the nation into dynastic chaos. Pearl merchants from Venice and Genoa, who once glided through Whitehall's gates in gilded carriages, found themselves summoned for questioning. Many were never heard from again, spirited away under the cover of darkness after hasty tribunals concluded their testimony against them. From that moment on, the Tudor court enacted the most stringent jewellery protocols in European history. No brooch or bauble might cross the threshold into royal sight without enduring at least 3 rounds of testing: a soak in wine vinegar to reveal any metallic flecks, a roasting over red-hot charcoal to spot discoloration, and a final scrub with bleaching lye to uncover hidden toxins. Even the Queen's own collection was methodically catalogued and retested each season. her gems stored in specially constructed wooden chests lined with lead and cedar to stave off contamination. Yet the darkest legend of all speaks of a single hairpin, its design so simple that it escaped official records. Rumour holds that Elizabeth retained this ownerless adornment, slipping it into her hair during private audiences. Should a dire moment arise, should the realm crumble under the weight of sedition, or should she face capture, she could unleash its hidden arsenic payload upon herself, denying her enemies the spectacle of her death. Even now, centuries later, courtiers' descendants still speak in hushed tones of that silent weapon, locked away in some forgotten drawer beneath the palace, waiting for the day when a queen must choose how she dies. Oh, and so, as our eyelids grow heavy with the weight of Tudor secrets, let us leave these perfumed halls of peril behind, carrying with us the memory that even the loveliest treasures in Elizabeth's court might conceal the most lethal of designs. Drifting from the glimmer of poisoned pearls and the secret cyanide bath that offered a final escape, we now descend even further into the hidden underworld of Tudor torture. Terrifying truth number 7. The Blood Well. The secret torture chamber. Even as Elizabeth I reigned over her court in radiant splendour, she sanctioned a subterranean horror beneath the very kitchens of Hampton Court Palace. According to secret memoranda unearthed at the Royal Library in the year 1820, the old service wing housed a forgotten well 8 metres deep, its sides lined with cold brick that served as a clandestine chamber of psychological torment. When a courtier or official was accused of treason, they were not sent to the public Tower of London. Instead, under cover of night, they were dragged through hidden corridors to this blood well. There, guards bound their wrists and ankles with iron shackles and suspended them against the damp brick walls. The only sound encouraging confession was the unending drip of water echoing from the well's depths, each drop falling like a distant heartbeat in the gloom. The prisoners wore heavy iron collars that cut into their flesh the moment they were hoisted above the well's rim. Then, with a sudden jerk, the ropes slackened, and they dangled over the abyss, too heavy to remain aloft, too restrained to find footing. In that limbo, they were left to stare into the black moor below, imagining every stagnant puddle at the bottom as thick with old blood. This drip torture preyed on the mind, an acoustic assault more chilling than any lash. Under flickering torchlight, interrogators circled, recording every groan, every plea, in careful shorthand. Confessions wrung from those terrorised by sound alone were later presented to Parliament as irrefutable evidence of conspiracy. By the time a prisoner's spirit broke, they were often willing to admit to plots they had never conceived. At least 2 souls saw fit to end their torment then and there. Descending into despair, they tied ropes around their necks and slipped from their cuffs, hanging themselves against the well's damp stones. Their broken bodies were left dangling for days, a grim warning to all who might question the Crown's authority. Most interrogations stretched on for days, with prisoners unable to sleep amid the relentless drip of water and the tramping of soldiers on stone floors above. The only respite came when guards delivered meagre chunks of stale bread and bowls of cold broth, leaving behind footsteps that echoed like distant drums. The stench of mildew and fear filled the cramped air, pressing on the lungs of each trembling victim. This terrible secret remained hidden until historian Charles Lyne discovered a cache of letters belonging to Bishop Richard Bancroft. Within those pages was a memorandum approving funds for the construction and maintenance of a private detention pit beneath the Great Hall at Hampton Court. Though Elizabeth never personally witnessed these horrors, her signature confirmed she approved the expense. Thereafter, court chroniclers referred only obliquely to the Hampton Court dungeon, a phrase that barely hinted at the abyss lurking beneath. Long after Elizabeth's death, the well was sealed and the service wing repurposed. Yet modern visitors who wander the labyrinth beneath the palace sometimes pause near boarded-up doorways, sensing a faint echo of those distant drips. And though the chandeliers above shimmer in golden light, the memory of that subterranean chamber where sound itself became an instrument of cruelty lingers like a half-remembered nightmare, reminding us of the dark depths even the most luminous rain can conceal. And as the echoes of dripping stones and rattling chains fade, our weary minds turn from hidden wells of agony to the invisible scourges that haunted Elizabeth's realm. Terrifying truth. Number 8. The Plague Within the Court. After bearing witness to the horrors of the Blood Well, one might imagine that no cruelty could exceed such darkness. Yet in the 1560s, Elizabeth I faced a menace even more indiscriminate, the Great Plague that swept through London and beyond. While dying bodies lined alleyways and mothers wept over empty cradles, the Queen's response revealed a chilling calculus: protect the crown at any human cost. In the year 1563, as the bubonic plague ravaged the streets of London, Elizabeth and her closest advisers quietly withdrew to Windsor Castle, leaving the city's common folk to confront the epidemic alone. No proclamations were issued for the poor. No medicines delivered, only royal carriages hastening out of the city under cover of night. The court's sudden departure marked the beginning of what officials termed collective isolation, a draconian measure that would see entire neighborhoods sealed off to contain infection. City decrees declared that any household in which a plague death occurred must remain shut behind locked doors. No scrap of fresh bread, no measure of clean water would be granted beyond the lone ration of a damp, half-baked loaf per day. Soldiers stood guard at every barricaded street, their muskets trained on frightened families who banged upon windows pleading for mercy. Amid the stench of rotting corpses piled in doorways, some desperate neighbours attempted to scale the barricades, only to be struck down by halberd blows or left to collapse in the filth. Local gentry, and even minor nobles, protested vehemently, sending petitions that read like nightmares: doomed to perish where we stand, never to glimpse our Queen's compassion. But Elizabeth, cocooned in Windsor's thick stone walls, believed that preserving her reign outweighed pity for the masses. From her lofty vantage, she watched bulletins tally the dead, confident that this ruthless quarantine would spare her court the ravages of disease. As the weeks dragged on, the death toll climbed inexorably. Parish registers recorded nearly 2,000 souls claimed in little more than 8 weeks. Westminster Abbey's ledgers list dozens of names simply marked "gone," without funeral rites or whispered prayers. Beneath the streets of modern London, the ancient sewers still hide skeletal remains, victims entombed alive by orders of Crown and Council, their voices never heard again. Meanwhile, Windsor's corridors echoed with laughter and music, the plague's horrors kept at bay by iron gates and loyal guards. Courtiers danced at masked balls, oblivious to the suffering beyond the castle moat. Elizabeth, though her heart surely quivered at news of each new outbreak, maintained her nerve. She issued orders that no servant from the quarantined wards might approach the royal apartments. Even the humblest page had to endure days of washing in scented baths before crossing the palace threshold. When at last the guards removed the barricades and the plague's tide receded, London survivors emerged to a scene of devastation. Rotten piles of discarded hope, empty vineyards overrun by weeds, and families broken beyond repair. No grand proclamations marked their return to normalcy, for the cost had been too high. To Elizabeth, this unspoken sacrifice was necessary, a grim lesson in the price of stability. Thus, the plague became not only a test of public health, but a testament to the Queen's merciless will. By isolating entire streets and forsaking the common people, she secured her court's safety, and in doing so, accepted the silent graves beneath London's stones as collateral. In hushed whispers, historians would later call this policy the plague within the court, a stark reminder that in Tudor England, royalty reigned supreme, even over life and death itself. Having witnessed the ruthless quarantine that sealed thousands beneath London's streets, we now step back into the glare of the footlights only to discover that the theatre itself had become a chamber of poisoning. Terrifying truth number 9. The poisoned air in the playhouse. After the chilling isolation of plague wards, one might expect the public theatre to offer relief and merriment. Yet under Queen Elizabeth I's patronage, the very stages she adored concealed a hidden menace. Toxic smoke that turned dramatic flair into neurological nightmare. Elizabeth prided herself on fostering the flourishing of English drama. Her court regularly sponsored travelling troupes, and the Globe and other playhouses brimmed with eager spectators. To evoke the eerie realms of heaven and hell, playwrights and stage managers devised elaborate special effects, censers burning fragrant herbs, blowpipes sending plumes of magical smoke across the stage. Yet in the late 1580s, court chemists discovered that many of these aromatic mixtures contained tetrachloride of mercury, a highly volatile compound, unseen and odorless in its most potent form. During one production dramatizing the tragic reign of Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's elder half-sister actors used this concoction to heighten tension. The villain's glove was dipped in a rich, silvery solution of mercury tetrachloride, then lightly brushed against the sleeve of the princess. As the acidic vapors filled the theatre vault, the audience gasped in awe at the shimmering cloud that billowed across the footlights. When the final curtain fell, however, applause turned to dismay. By the next morning, both leading players awoke, with violent neurological tremors, hands and arms shaking uncontrollably, legs buckling beneath them at the slightest movement. Their voices, once strong, quivered in terrified whispers. Worse still, those seated in the front rows complained of burning eyes, hoarseness, and brief episodes of blurred vision and dizziness. In hushed circles, they spoke of phantom flames licking at their faces, and of nightmares filled with writhing serpents. Alarmed, Elizabeth's physicians and the Master of Revels launched an inquiry. They found that residual mercury had permeated not only the painted backdrops but also the heavy damask curtains and wooden flooring. Each slow exhalation from the actors, and every gentle breeze from hidden bellows, spread lethal fine droplets, depositing on every surface. Night after night, an unwitting swath of theatre-goers, servants, and even the Queen's own pages breathed in enough neurotoxin to induce temporary paralysis and, in some cases, lasting neurological damage. One court physician, Master Tobias Fenton, penned a private memorandum to Elizabeth detailing the tremulous afflictions haunting the stagehands and pleading for urgent reform. He described the telltale metallic sheen that clung to costumes, the soft footfalls of mercury vapors drifting through candle-lit aisles, and the silent cruelty of an effect that promised wonder but delivered horror. Disturbed by these revelations, Elizabeth issued an edict banning all mercury-based theatricals. Her order replaced the toxic brews with safer incense imported from the Ottoman lands' sweet myrrh and frankincense intended to evoke otherworldly mists without injuring throat or brain. Yet word of the poisoned theatres spread faster than any official reprieve. Londoners spoke in trembling tones of crowded balconies emptied by convulsions, of patrons stumbling into the damp night air, gasping for breath. Even clandestine performances in private chambers could not escape suspicion. Actors found themselves scrubbed raw in vinegar baths, their costumes trained to test every bolt of velvet and strip of lace for telltale residue. And though the court boasted that no further poisonings occurred, the legend of the playhouse's secret death fog endured in tavern gossip and moral sermons alike. Into the hush of closing time, weary Londoners would whisper, "Beware the footlights glow, for beneath the glamour may still lurk a silent, invisible dread." As the last echo of toxic theatre smoke fades from your mind, let your eyelids grow heavy once more, for our final dread awaits in the hush of courtly superstition. Terrifying truth number 10. The curse of virginity. In the somnolent corridors of Whitehall, beneath the chandelier's dim glow, Queen Elizabeth I nurtured the legend of her perpetual maidenhood, a political talisman as potent as any sword. Yet few realized that the Queen believed a darker magic lay behind her chastity, a family curse upon the Tudors, should she ever relinquish the supreme state of virginity. Thus, in a whispering decree, she outlawed every gift suggestive of carnal intent, silken robes that clung too closely, exotic oils that stirred desire to safeguard her reputation and her realm. By the close of 1599, Sir Christopher Hatton, once considered the most likely husband consort, inadvertently dispatched a shipment of gossamer Italian velvet to the palace. The very thought of those diaphanous folds brushing the Queen's skin enraged Elizabeth. She seized the fabrics at once. Had Hatton confined to the damp, mouldy dungeon beneath the castle her infamous wet cell, and accused him of plotting to defile the royal bloodline. For 2 long years Hatton was barred from court, his stipend withheld, though his earldom remained as bitter compensation. Elizabeth's faith in this mystical edict ran so deep that she employed her chambermaids as guardians of her purity, forbidding even female physicians from too intimate an examination. Court rumour held that on her birthday each year she would take a sharp knife and, in a ritual vow of unbroken chastity, inscribe Virginia Regina upon her palm, the tiny wound bearing witness to her unwavering oath. It was said that only by her own fresh blood could the curse be kept at bay. When unsettling whispers spread that the Queen might suffer a hemorrhage, panic seized the palace. Healers were summoned with urgency to staunch the unseen flow, and heavy drapes screened her bedchamber so no maidservant might dare mention the dreaded word virginity, lest the mere reminder unleash the ancient curse. Night after night, courtiers stood vigil outside her doors, half asleep, half fearful, knowing that to question her purity was to summon ruin upon the Tudor legacy. This obsession with the Virgin Queen's chastity metamorphosed into the most fearsome instrument of her authority. Any noble bold enough to hint at marriage or romance faced instant suspicion of depraved intentions, loss of royal favour, or worse, secret exile to those damp cells where despair gnawed at the spirit more fiercely than rats at the bones. In manipulating this spectral threat, Elizabeth governed not only hearts but minds, turning love and companionship into battlegrounds for control. Even centuries later, the haunting image of the blood-scribed oath lingers in history's gloom. The curse of virginity transformed into a chilling tool of statecraft, a whispered legend that the Tudors would crumble if their sovereign ever broke her vow. And so, the legend of the Virgin Queen endures an emblem of icy resolve and mysterious power, a shiver down the spine of every who recalls that in Elizabeth's England, purity was more than personal virtue. It was the very fulcrum of life and death, in a kingdom built upon superstition and steel. And so, through tonight's journey, we have stood in silent awe before the horrifying truths hidden behind the Virgin Queen's crown. These 10 profound secrets are not merely historical tales recreating a dark chapter of the Tudor court, but they also evoke many lessons, values, and messages that can be applied to modern life. First, today's video helps viewers recognize that power, however majestic, always conceals its shadows.